It started with a sound. Not a loud sound, not a crash, not an explosion, just the quiet ticking of a clock. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel woke up slowly and stared at the ceiling. The room looked normal. A small hotel room. White walls, a window with thin curtains, a wooden table with a lamp, and the clock on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel blinked. For a moment he forgot where he was. Then he remembered. He was traveling, driving across the country, looking for quiet places, small towns, old roads, places that most people never visit. And that was how he found the town of Harrow Creek, a tiny place hidden between forests and mountains, the kind of town where everyone knows everyone, the kind of town where nothing interesting ever happens. At least, that's what Daniel thought yesterday. Daniel sat up in bed. The clock on the wall showed 3:14. He frowned. "That's strange," he whispered. He remembered waking up during the night, and the clock had also said 3:14. He shrugged. Maybe the clock was broken. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the town looked quiet. Too quiet. The street was empty. No cars moving, no people walking. Just a soft morning fog drifting through the road. Daniel rubbed his eyes. Something felt off. Not wrong, just unusual. He grabbed his jacket and left the room. The hallway of the hotel was silent. His footsteps echoed softly against the wooden floor. When he reached the lobby, the hotel owner was sitting behind the counter, an old man with gray hair, reading a newspaper. He didn't look up. "Morning," Daniel said. The man slowly lowered the newspaper. "Morning," he replied. Daniel hesitated. "What time is it?" The old man glanced at the clock behind him. 3:14. Daniel froze. "What?" The old man smiled calmly. 3:14. Daniel turned and looked at the wall clock in the lobby. 3:14. Exactly the same. Daniel felt a strange chill. "That's weird," he said. The old man just nodded. "Enjoy your stay." Daniel stepped outside. The town looked peaceful. Small houses, old wooden buildings, a quiet cafe on the corner. Everything looked normal, but something in the air felt strange. He walked down the street. A woman opened the door of a bakery. She carried a tray of bread. She smiled politely. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," Daniel replied. But the moment she said it, Daniel felt something strange. The way she spoke, the way she moved, it felt familiar. Too familiar, like he had already seen it. Daniel shook his head. "Maybe I'm just tired," he muttered. He continued walking. A few minutes later he reached the cafe. The door opened with a small bell sound. Ding! Inside the cafe sat 3 people. A man reading a book, a woman drinking coffee, and a young boy drawing something on paper. The waitress looked up. "Morning," she said with a smile. "Coffee?" Daniel paused. That sentence. Something about it felt very strange. "Yes," he said slowly. The waitress turned to the coffee machine. Daniel sat down near the window. The ticking sound returned. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel looked around the room. Everything looked normal. The same quiet town, the same calm morning. But suddenly something happened. The boy at the table dropped his pencil. Clack! The pencil rolled across the floor. Daniel watched it carefully. The boy picked it up. Then the boy said something. "Mom, my pencil fell again." Daniel froze. "Again?" The mother sighed. "You always drop it." The boy nodded. Daniel suddenly felt dizzy. He knew that moment. He had seen it before, exactly the same pencil, the same words, the same sigh. He slowly stood up. The waitress returned with coffee. "Here you go," she said. Daniel stared at her. "You said that yesterday." The waitress looked confused. "What?" "You said that yesterday," Daniel repeated. The woman laughed. "You arrived this morning." Daniel shook his head. "No." He looked at the clock above the counter. 3:14. Still. The same time. It hadn't moved, not even 1 minute. Daniel felt his heart beating faster. Something was very wrong. He ran outside. The street looked exactly the same. The bakery woman stepped outside again, carrying the same tray. "Good morning," she said. Daniel stared at her. The same words, the same smile, the same movement. Everything was repeating. Daniel slowly whispered to himself, "This town is stuck." And somewhere far away in the distance, a clock continued ticking. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel stood in the middle of the street. The fog drifted slowly across the road. The bakery woman smiled politely. "Good morning," she said again. Daniel didn't answer. He just stared at her. The same tray of bread, the same movement, the same voice. Everything was repeating exactly the same way. Daniel stepped backward slowly. His heart was beating faster now. "This isn't possible," he whispered. He turned around and looked down the street. The cafe door opened again. The same man walked out holding a newspaper. Daniel had seen him 10 minutes ago, or maybe an hour ago, or maybe yesterday. But the man walked exactly the same way, the same steps, the same expression. Daniel grabbed his phone. He checked the time. 3:14. Still, it had not changed. He opened the stopwatch and started it. If time was repeating, the stopwatch should still move. Seconds passed. 10 seconds. 30 seconds. 1 minute. The stopwatch was working, but the town was not. Daniel felt a strange pressure in his chest. The world around him was moving, but the moment itself was stuck. He walked quickly back toward the hotel. The same old man sat behind the counter, reading the same newspaper. Daniel slammed his hand on the desk. Something is wrong with this town. The old man slowly lowered the newspaper. "Enjoy your stay." The exact same words. Daniel stepped closer. "Do you remember talking to me earlier?" The man blinked slowly. "You just arrived." Daniel shook his head. "No. I woke up here before." The man simply returned to reading his newspaper, as if Daniel had said nothing. Daniel stepped away from the counter. His mind was racing. Everyone was repeating, but he was not. He could remember everything, which meant one thing. He was outside the loop. But why? He walked upstairs to his room again. The hallway looked identical, the same carpet, the same flickering light above the stairs. He opened his room door. The clock on the wall still showed 3:14. Daniel walked closer to it. He listened. Tick, tick, tick. The second hand was not moving. The clock was frozen. Daniel looked at his phone again. The stopwatch now showed 6 minutes. So time was moving, but not for the town. He grabbed a notebook from his bag. If the moment repeated, he needed proof. He wrote one sentence on the wall beside the clock. "This is a loop." Then he sat down and waited. The ticking sound continued. Tick, tick, tick. And then suddenly, everything went dark. For less than a second, the lights flickered, the room blurred, and Daniel felt the strange, dizzy feeling again. When his vision returned, he was lying in bed, the same ceiling, the same ticking clock. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel sat up instantly. No way. He ran to the wall. The message was gone. The wall was clean again. The clock read 3:14. Daniel slowly exhaled. The loop reset. But something strange had happened. When the reset occurred, for a brief moment, the world had glitched, like a broken video. Daniel grabbed his notebook again. He wrote quickly, "Loop confirmed." Then he placed the notebook on the table. He wanted to test something. He walked out of the room again, down the hallway, into the lobby. The old man sat behind the counter, reading the same newspaper. "Morning," Daniel said carefully. The man lowered the paper. "Morning." Daniel pointed at the clock. "What time is it?" 3:14. Daniel nodded slowly. Everything was repeating perfectly. But now he knew something else. The loop always restarted at the same moment, 3:14, which meant something important. Something had happened at that exact time. Something powerful enough to trap the entire town in a repeating moment. Daniel stepped outside again. The bakery woman appeared. The cafe bell rang. The pencil dropped inside the cafe. Everything was exactly the same. Daniel walked toward the center of town. There was a small square with a statue of the town founder. Under the statue was an old clock tower. Daniel looked up. The clock tower also showed the same time, 3:14, and then Daniel noticed something strange. The clock tower was still ticking, but the hands were not moving. Tick, tick, tick. The sound echoed across the empty square. Daniel stepped closer to the tower. The door at the bottom was locked. But something about the ticking sound felt wrong. It was too loud, too heavy, like the clock was struggling. Daniel leaned his ear against the door, and that was when he heard something else. A second ticking. Tick, tick, tick. But this ticking was different, slower, deeper, and it was coming from below the tower, from somewhere underground. Daniel slowly stepped back. A cold realization spread through his mind. The town wasn't repeating randomly. The loop was connected to the clock tower, and whatever was beneath it. Daniel whispered quietly, "I think I found the center of the loop." But he had no idea yet that someone else in the town also remembered every reset. Daniel stood in front of the clock tower for a long time. The ticking sound echoed through the quiet town square. Tick, tick, tick. But now Daniel knew there were two different sounds. One ticking from the frozen clock, and another, deeper ticking from somewhere underground. He walked slowly around the tower. The old building looked ancient. The bricks were cracked. The wooden door was locked with a rusty chain. But something strange caught his attention. Scratches on the door. Fresh scratches. Someone had tried to open it, recently. Daniel knelt down to look closer. The marks looked like someone had used a metal tool, maybe a crowbar or a screwdriver. Daniel whispered to himself, "So I'm not the first one who noticed." Suddenly a voice spoke behind him. "You're not." Daniel jumped and turned around. A woman stood a few steps away. She looked about 30 years old. Dark hair, a worn leather jacket, and tired eyes. Eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in a long time. Daniel stared at her. "You heard that too?" The woman nodded slowly. "The ticking under the tower." Daniel felt his chest tighten. "You remember the loop?" The woman crossed her arms. "Yes." Daniel stepped closer. "How long?" The woman looked at the frozen clock above them. "Long enough to stop counting." Daniel blinked. "You've been trapped here longer than me." The woman nodded. "My name is Elena." "Daniel." They stood there for a moment. The town square was quiet. The same woman from the bakery walked by again carrying the same tray of bread. The same man crossed the street with the newspaper. The same car drove past without stopping. Everything repeated perfectly, except them. Elena looked at Daniel carefully. "You figured it out fast." Daniel shrugged. "I test things." She pointed at the clock tower. "So do I." Daniel looked back at the locked door. "You tried to break in?" Elena nodded.
"Many times." "What's inside?" "I don't know." "But the ticking comes from below." Daniel leaned against the tower wall. "When does the loop reset?" Elena answered immediately. "Exactly 20 minutes after you wake up." Daniel frowned. 20 minutes? "Always." Daniel looked at his phone's stopwatch. It showed 11 minutes. "That means we still have time." Elena shook her head. "Not enough to break that door." Daniel thought for a moment. "If the loop resets every 20 minutes, we have unlimited attempts." Elena smiled slightly. "Now you're thinking like someone trapped in a time loop." Daniel glanced at the scratches again. "How many attempts have you made?" Elena sighed. "I stopped counting after the first 100. Daniel stared at her. 100 loops? "At least." "And you never got inside?" "No." Daniel looked around the square. The loop was repeating again. The bakery woman appeared again. The cafe bell rang again. Daniel suddenly asked something important. "Do the people notice us?" Elena shook her head. "No." "They reset too." "They forget everything." Daniel slowly nodded. "So the town is frozen in time." Elena pointed at the clock tower. "And that thing is the anchor." Daniel listened again to the deep ticking under the ground. Tick, tick, tick. The sound felt heavier now, almost like a heartbeat. Daniel whispered, "What if the clock tower is not the cause?" Elena looked at him. "What do you mean?" "What if it's just the lock?" Elena frowned. "The lock for what?" Daniel looked directly at the tower door. "The thing causing the loop." They both stood in silence. The ticking continued. Tick, tick, tick. Then Elena suddenly smiled. "I like that idea." Daniel checked his stopwatch again. 16 minutes. 4 minutes left. Elena stepped closer to the door. "If the reset happens in 4 minutes, we should test something." Daniel nodded. "What do you have in mind?" Elena reached into her jacket pocket. She pulled out a small metal screwdriver. Daniel laughed softly. "You came prepared." Elena knelt down beside the rusty lock. "Every loop I get one little improvement." She inserted the screwdriver. The metal creaked. The chain rattled slightly. The lock resisted. Daniel watched the stopwatch. 18 minutes. Elena twisted the tool harder. The lock cracked slightly. 19 minutes. The chain moved. "Almost," Elena whispered. The ticking from underground suddenly became louder. Tick, tick, tick. Then the world flickered. The sky darkened for a split second. The buildings blurred. Daniel felt the dizzy pull again. The reset was starting. Elena looked up. "Next loop, we break it." Daniel nodded. And then the world went dark. When Daniel opened his eyes again, he was lying in the hotel bed. The clock on the wall showed the same time, 3:14. Tick, tick, tick. But this time Daniel smiled, because now he knew something important. He wasn't trapped in the loop alone. And next time, the tower door was going to open. Daniel woke up instantly. The ticking clock on the wall said the same thing again. 3:14. Tick, tick, tick. But this time, he didn't panic. He jumped out of bed, grabbed his jacket, and ran out of the room. Down the hallway,
down the stairs, into the lobby. The old man behind the counter lowered his newspaper. "Morning," he said. Daniel didn't stop. He ran straight outside. The fog was drifting across the street again. The bakery woman was about to open her door. Daniel ignored everything. He ran toward the town square. Elena was already there, standing beside the clock tower. She looked up as he approached. "You move faster every loop," she said. Daniel caught his breath. "How many minutes?" Elena checked her watch. 3 minutes since reset." Daniel nodded. "Good." Elena pulled the screwdriver from her jacket again. "This time we finish it." They both knelt beside the lock. The rusty chain hung across the wooden door. Daniel held the chain steady while Elena forced the screwdriver into the lock. Metal scraped. The lock creaked. Daniel watched the stopwatch. 5 minutes. "Keep going," he said. Elena twisted harder. The metal bent slightly. 7 minutes. The chain moved. 8 minutes. The lock cracked with a sharp sound. Clack! They both froze. Daniel slowly pulled the chain away. The heavy wooden door creaked open. Behind it was a narrow spiral staircase leading down. Cold air rushed upward from the darkness. Daniel looked at Elena. "You've never seen this part before." Elena shook her head. "Never got past the lock." Daniel turned on the flashlight on his phone. A dim beam of light cut through the darkness. "Let's go." They stepped inside. The staircase twisted downward into the ground. Stone walls, old steps worn smooth by time. The air smelled damp and ancient. Their footsteps echoed. Step, step, step. The ticking sound grew louder as they descended. Tick, tick, tick. But now it sounded different, deeper, slower, almost like a giant mechanical heartbeat. After several minutes they reached the bottom. A heavy iron door stood in front of them. It was already slightly open. Daniel pushed it slowly. The door groaned loudly. Inside was a large underground chamber. The room was enormous. Stone walls curved upward like the inside of a cave, and in the center of the chamber stood a massive machine. Daniel stopped walking. "What is that?" The machine looked like an enormous clock, but far more complex. Huge gears rotated slowly. Metal rods moved back and forth. A giant pendulum swung across the room. Tick, tick, tick. Every movement echoed through the chamber. The machine was alive. Elena whispered, "That's the loop." Daniel stepped closer. The giant clock mechanism was connected to dozens of smaller devices. Cables ran into the walls, into the ground, into the ceiling. Daniel circled the machine carefully. "Someone built this." Elena nodded. "Not recently." The metal looked old, very old. Some parts were rusted, others still shined like polished steel. Daniel pointed at the center. A glowing crystal was suspended inside the machine. The crystal pulsed faintly. Every pulse matched the ticking. Tick, pulse. Tick, pulse. Elena frowned. "That crystal is controlling the loop." Daniel stepped closer. "But why?" Elena searched the walls. Old papers were pinned to wooden boards. Blueprints, notes, equations written in faded ink. Daniel grabbed one of the papers. At the top was a name. Professor Adrian Hale. Below it were dozens of calculations, and one sentence written in large letters. Temporal containment experiment. Daniel read it out loud. Temporal containment. Elena looked confused. "What does that mean?" Daniel thought for a moment. Someone tried to trap a moment in time. Elena looked at the machine again. And it worked. Daniel nodded slowly. But something went wrong. The crystal pulsed again. Tick, pulse. Tick, pulse. Daniel looked closer at the crystal. Cracks ran across its surface, tiny fractures, like it had been damaged. "That's the problem," Daniel said. Elena stepped beside him. "The crystal is unstable." Daniel nodded, "and the machine keeps resetting the same moment to contain the damage." Elena crossed her arms. "So the town is trapped because the machine is broken." Daniel looked up at the pendulum swinging above them. "If the crystal breaks completely," Elena finished the sentence, "the loop collapses," Daniel whispered, "and time starts moving again." They both stood silently. The ticking echoed across the chamber. Tick, tick, tick. Then Elena asked the most important question. "How do we stop it?" Daniel looked at the machine again. Hundreds of gears, thousands of moving parts, and one glowing crystal holding everything together. He took a slow breath. "We break the loop." Elena raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly do we do that?" Daniel pointed at the crystal. "We stop the clock." Elena stared at the glowing crystal. "You want to break it?" she asked. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No. If we destroy the crystal, we might destroy the entire town with it." Elena crossed her arms. "Then what do we do?" Daniel walked slowly around the machine. The gears were enormous, each one turning with slow, mechanical precision. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel looked carefully at the structure. "This machine isn't just repeating time," he said. "It's holding something in place." Elena frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel pointed at the crystal again. "The crystal is damaged. The machine is compensating." Elena looked confused. "Compensating for what?" Daniel stepped closer to the center of the machine. "The machine is trying to stabilize time." "But every reset weakens the crystal more." Elena slowly understood. "So every loop is making the problem worse." Daniel nodded. "Exactly." The ticking sound suddenly grew louder. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel looked up. The pendulum had started swinging faster. "That's new," Elena said. Daniel checked his phone. The stopwatch showed 17 minutes. "We're close to another reset." Elena stepped back. "What happens if we're down here when it resets?" Daniel thought for a moment. "I don't know." Elena gave a nervous laugh. "That's comforting." Daniel studied the crystal again. "Look at the fractures," he said. "They're spreading." Elena leaned closer. Tiny glowing cracks ran through the crystal. Each pulse of light made them grow slightly longer. "That thing is about to shatter," Elena whispered. Daniel nodded. "And when it does, the loop will collapse." Elena looked around the massive underground chamber. "So if we want to stop the loop safely," Daniel finished her thought, "we need to stabilize the crystal." Elena sighed. "And how exactly do we do that?" Daniel pointed at the machine controls. Several mechanical levers surrounded the crystal chamber. Each lever was labeled with old brass plates. "Frequency regulator, temporal stabilizer, energy limiter." Elena laughed nervously. "I have no idea what any of that means." Daniel studied the controls carefully. "These settings control the loop." Elena crossed her arms. "So we just guess?" Daniel shook his head. "No." He pointed at the notes on the wall again. "Professor Hale left instructions." They both moved toward the old blueprints pinned to the stone wall. The papers were fragile. Some of the ink had faded, but the most important words were still readable. Daniel read the notes slowly. "Temporal containment must be maintained at harmonic resonance." Elena stared at him. "That sounds like science talk for something terrible." Daniel kept reading. "If resonance drops below stability threshold, the crystal fractures." Elena pointed at the machine. So the machine is out of tune. Daniel nodded. Exactly. He looked back at the controls. We need to bring the resonance back into balance. Elena sighed. And how do we know when we're close? Daniel looked up at the pendulum again. The pendulum speed. Elena followed his gaze. The pendulum was now swinging much faster than before. Tick, tick, tick. The sound echoed violently across the chamber. Daniel whispered, "The machine is losing control." Elena checked her watch. 3 minutes until reset. Daniel grabbed the first lever. Then we don't have time to be careful. He pulled the lever halfway down. The machine groaned. Several gears slowed. The pendulum changed rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Elena grabbed another lever. What about this one? Daniel glanced at the brass label. Energy limiter. Lower it. Elena pushed the lever. The crystal pulsed brighter. The cracks stopped spreading. For a moment the machine sounded calmer. Daniel whispered, "That's good." But then the crystal suddenly flashed. A violent pulse of light filled the chamber. The gears screamed. Metal scraped against metal. Elena jumped back. That didn't sound good. Daniel looked at the crystal. The cracks were glowing now, brighter than before. He whispered slowly, "The resonance is unstable." Elena stepped closer again. "So what do we do?" Daniel took a deep breath. "We keep adjusting." The pendulum swung wildly above them. Tick, tick, tick. The ticking was becoming louder and louder. The entire machine shook. Daniel grabbed another lever. Temporal stabilizer. He pushed it upward. The pendulum slowed. The crystal dimmed slightly. Elena stared at the glowing fractures. "They're shrinking." Daniel nodded. "It's working." But suddenly, the chamber lights flickered. The entire machine vibrated. The reset was starting. Daniel looked at Elena. "We're out of time." Elena grabbed the final lever. "Then next loop, we finish this." The chamber flickered. The ticking stopped. And darkness swallowed the room. Daniel opened his eyes again. The hotel ceiling stared back at him. The clock on the wall ticked quietly. 3:14. Tick, tick, tick. But this time, Daniel smiled. Because now, they knew how to stop the loop. They just needed one more attempt. Daniel opened his eyes again. The same ceiling, the same ticking clock. 3:14. Tick, tick, tick. But this time, something felt different. Daniel didn't hesitate. He jumped out of bed immediately and ran out of the room. Down the hallway, down the stairs, through the lobby. The old man behind the counter lowered his newspaper again. "Morning," he said. Daniel didn't stop. He was already running toward the town square. The fog drifted across the streets again. The bakery woman stepped outside again. The cafe bell rang again. Everything repeated exactly as before. But Daniel knew the pattern now. He reached the clock tower. Elena was already waiting there. She looked at him with a tired smile. "Ready for round 200 and something?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "This time, we finish it." They removed the chain quickly. The lock had already been weakened in previous loops. The door opened easily. Cold air rushed from the staircase again. Daniel turned on his phone flashlight. "Let's go." They rushed down the spiral staircase. Step, step, step. The ticking grew louder again. Tick, tick, tick. But this time, the sound felt unstable, like a machine struggling to stay alive. When they reached the underground chamber again, the machine looked worse. The gears were moving faster. The pendulum swung violently. The crystal glowed brighter than before, and the cracks inside it had grown larger. Elena stared at it. "That thing won't survive many more resets." Daniel nodded. "We have one chance." He moved to the control levers again. Same adjustments as last time. Elena took her position beside the energy limiter. Daniel checked the stopwatch. 3 minutes since reset. "Let's start." Daniel pulled the frequency regulator slightly downward. The gears slowed. The pendulum steadied. Tick, tick, tick. Elena lowered the energy limiter. The crystal dimmed slightly. The glowing cracks stopped spreading. Daniel whispered, "Good." But suddenly the machine shook violently. A loud metallic sound echoed across the chamber. Clang! Elena grabbed the wall. "What was that?" Daniel looked up. One of the large gears had cracked. The machine was deteriorating. "Every reset damages it more," Daniel said. The pendulum suddenly swung faster again. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel pushed the temporal stabilizer upward. The pendulum slowed again. The machine calmed slightly. The crystal pulsed softly. Tick, pulse, tick, pulse. Elena watched the cracks carefully. "They're shrinking again." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Then we're on the right track." But then something unexpected happened. A loud voice echoed through the chamber. "You shouldn't be here." Daniel froze. Elena turned around quickly. A man stood in the shadows near the far wall. An older man, thin, gray hair, wearing an old laboratory coat. Daniel whispered, "Who are you?" The man stepped into the light. His face looked pale and exhausted. "My name is Adrian Hale." Daniel's eyes widened. "The professor?" The man nodded slowly. "The one who built this machine." Elena stared at him. "You're alive." Hale looked at the crystal. "For now." Daniel stepped closer. "You trapped the town in a time loop." Hale shook his head. "I trapped something else." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Hale pointed at the crystal. "That crystal isn't just a power source. It's a containment field." Elena looked confused. "For what?" Hale spoke quietly. "For a moment that should never exist." Daniel stared at him. "What moment?" Hale pointed at the clock above the machine. 3:14. 3:14, he said. "That moment." Daniel shook his head. "I don't understand." Hale sighed. "Time is fragile. Most people think time moves like a straight line. But sometimes, time breaks." Daniel glanced at the unstable crystal. "And you tried to fix it?" Hale nodded. 20 years ago." Elena whispered, "And you failed." Hale looked at the machine sadly. "I delayed the collapse. But I couldn't stop it." Daniel pointed at the crystal. "The cracks are getting worse." Hale nodded again. "The containment field is failing." Elena crossed her arms. "So why not shut the machine down?" Hale looked directly at her. "Because if the containment fails, the broken moment escapes," Daniel whispered slowly, "and time collapses." Hale nodded. "The entire timeline could fracture." The machine suddenly roared again. The pendulum swung wildly. The crystal flashed violently. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel looked at Hale. "How do we fix it?" Hale stared at the machine. "Stabilize the resonance." Daniel nodded. "That's what we're trying to do." Hale stepped forward slowly. "Then let me help." Daniel hesitated. "You built this machine."
Hale nodded.
And I'm the only one who understands how to stop it. Elena checked her watch. 6 minutes until reset. Hale looked at the control levers. We don't have much time. Daniel stepped aside. Tell us what to do. Hale placed his hands on the controls. The resonance must match the crystal frequency. He moved one lever slightly. The machine responded instantly. The pendulum slowed. The crystal dimmed. The cracks stopped glowing. Daniel whispered, "That worked." But Hale didn't smile. Not yet. The machine continued ticking. Tick, tick, tick. And for the first time since the loop began, the clock above the machine twitched. The minute hand moved. From 3:14 toward 3:15. Daniel stared at it in disbelief. "Elena," she whispered, "time is moving." Daniel stared at the clock above the machine. The minute hand trembled. 3:14. Then slowly, it moved. Just a tiny shift. But it was real. 3:15, Elena whispered. The entire chamber fell silent for a moment. Even the massive gears seemed to hesitate. Tick, tick, tick. But now the ticking sounded different. Alive. Daniel turned toward Professor Hale. "You did it." Hale didn't celebrate. He was watching the crystal carefully. The cracks were still there, thin, glowing fractures spreading through the center. "This isn't stable yet," Hale said quietly. Elena stepped closer to the machine. "But time moved." "Yes," Hale replied, "and that means the containment field is weakening." Daniel frowned. "Wait, weakening?" Hale nodded slowly. The loop was holding the fracture in time together. If we break the loop too quickly, the fracture spreads. Daniel looked at the crystal again. "What happens then?" Hale answered calmly, "Reality tears." Elena blinked. "That sounds bad." Daniel exhaled slowly. "So we can't just stop the machine." "No," Hale said. "We must guide time forward." Daniel glanced at the control panel. "Gradually." Hale nodded. "Exactly." The machine groaned again. One of the large gears screeched as it rotated. The pendulum slowed slightly. Tick, tick, tick. Elena checked her watch. 12 minutes since reset. Daniel smiled. "No reset yet." Hale didn't look convinced. "The system is unstable." Suddenly the crystal flashed again. A sharp beam of blue light shot across the chamber. The air vibrated. The walls trembled. Daniel grabbed the railing. "What was that?" Hale looked alarmed. "The fracture is reacting." Elena stepped back. "Reacting to what?" Hale pointed at the crystal. "To movement in time." Daniel realized something. The machine is holding time in place, but it also depends on the loop. Hale nodded. The loop stabilized the fracture. But it also trapped the town. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "So if we break the loop too fast, the fracture explodes." Hale nodded again. "Exactly." Elena sighed. "So what's the plan?" Hale stepped toward the control levers again. "We move time forward, slowly." Daniel looked up at the clock again. The minute hand was now halfway between 3:14 and 3:15. Each movement of the pendulum pushed it slightly further. Tick, tick, tick. The machine vibrated violently. The crystal glowed brighter. The fractures pulsed like lightning trapped inside glass. Elena whispered, "That thing is going to shatter." Hale grabbed the frequency regulator. "We need perfect resonance." Daniel watched carefully. "What happens if we lose it?" Hale didn't hesitate. "The fracture escapes." and time collapses across the entire region. Daniel swallowed. No pressure, then. Hale slowly adjusted the regulator. The machine responded instantly. The pendulum steadied. Tick, tick, tick. The crystal dimmed slightly. The fractures stopped glowing. Daniel exhaled. That helped. Elena suddenly pointed upward. Look! The clock had moved again. 3:15. The minute hand clicked into place. The sound echoed across the chamber. For the first time in countless loops, time had moved forward. Daniel whispered softly, "We broke the loop." But Hale shook his head. "No, we only opened the door." Suddenly the machine shook violently. Every gear roared. The pendulum accelerated again. Tick, tick, tick. The crystal exploded with light. A deep rumbling filled the chamber. The walls cracked. Dust fell from the ceiling. Daniel shouted, "What's happening?" Hale looked terrified for the first time. "The fracture is expanding." Elena grabbed the control lever. "Then stop it!" Hale pointed at the crystal. "We must synchronize the resonance." Daniel moved beside him. "Tell us how." Hale pointed to 3 separate levers. Frequency, energy, stabilizer. We must move them together. Elena grabbed the energy limiter. Daniel took the stabilizer. Hale held the frequency regulator. The machine screamed as the crystal pulsed again. Tick, tick, tick. The fractures spread across the crystal surface, thin, glowing lines racing through the glass. Hale counted slowly. 3, 2, 1. They pulled the levers together. The machine froze. Every gear stopped. The pendulum halted in mid-swing. And the crystal stopped glowing. For a moment, the chamber was completely silent. No ticking, no movement, just stillness. Daniel whispered, "Did we?" Suddenly the clock above them clicked again. 3:16. The machine restarted, but this time the sound was different, smooth, stable. Tick, tick, tick. Hale slowly smiled. It worked. Elena leaned against the railing. "So the loop is gone?" Hale nodded. "Time is moving normally again." Daniel looked at the crystal. The fractures were still visible, but they no longer glowed. The machine hummed quietly. Stable. Alive. Outside the chamber, for the first time in 20 years, the town of Harrow Creek moved forward in time. Cars started driving. People continued walking. Conversations continued. No resets, no repetition. Just time, flowing again. Daniel looked at the clock one more time. 3:17. And it kept moving. Daniel watched the clock carefully. 3:17. And the minute hand kept moving. Slowly, but steadily. Tick, tick, tick. For the first time since he arrived in Harrow Creek, time was no longer repeating. The massive machine in the underground chamber hummed quietly. The gears rotated smoothly. The pendulum swung in a calm rhythm. Everything felt different now. Stable. Alive. Elena leaned against the railing and exhaled deeply. "I can't believe it," she said. "No reset." Daniel nodded. No reset. Professor Hale stood beside the machine, watching the crystal. The fractures were still visible inside the glowing core, but the dangerous light inside them had faded. The crystal now pulsed softly. Tick, pulse. Tick, pulse. Hale placed his hand gently against the metal casing. The containment field is stable again. Daniel looked around the chamber. So it's over? Hale nodded slowly. Yes. But the machine must continue running. Elena frowned. Forever? Hale looked up at the clock. For as long as the fracture exists. Daniel crossed his arms. What exactly is the fracture? Hale remained silent for a moment. Then he answered quietly. Time tried to correct itself. Daniel didn't understand. Correct what? Hale walked toward the old papers on the wall. 20 years ago, something happened in this town. Daniel followed him. What kind of something? Hale pointed to one of the old diagrams. The moment 3:14. That moment shouldn't exist. Elena tilted her head. What happened at 3:14? Hale spoke slowly. There was an accident. A train derailment. Daniel blinked. A train? Hale nodded. A chemical transport train. Highly unstable material. Elena crossed her arms. And it exploded. Hale nodded again. The explosion should have destroyed the entire town. Daniel frowned. But the town is still here. Hale looked back at the machine. Because I stopped the moment before it happened. Daniel stared at him. You froze time. Hale nodded. I created a containment loop. The moment before the explosion. Daniel suddenly understood. So the train never crashed. Hale nodded again. The accident was trapped in the fracture. Elena whispered. So the loop saved the town. Hale looked exhausted. Yes. But the machine slowly began failing. Daniel glanced at the crystal again. And the fracture almost escaped. Hale nodded. If it had, the explosion would have happened 20 years later. Daniel looked toward the tunnel leading upstairs. And the entire town would have been destroyed. Hale gave a quiet nod. Daniel leaned against the wall. That's insane. Elena looked around the chamber. So what happens now? Hale pointed at the crystal. The fracture is stable. But it still exists, Daniel frowned. So the train crash still hasn't happened. Hale shook his head. No. The moment was repaired. The explosion no longer exists in the timeline. Daniel slowly processed that. So the accident is gone. Hale nodded. Erased. Elena smiled faintly. So we saved the town. Daniel looked at Hale. You saved the town 20 years ago. Hale shook his head. I only delayed the collapse. Daniel looked around the chamber again. But now it's fixed. Hale finally smiled. Yes. For the first time in the entire conversation, Professor Hale looked relieved. The machine continued its calm rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel checked the clock again. 3:19. Time was moving forward. Outside the chamber, life continued normally. The cafe customers finished their drinks. The bakery woman sold bread. Cars drove down the streets. And no one noticed that for 20 years, their town had been trapped in a single moment. Daniel looked at Elena. So what now? Elena laughed quietly. I don't know. I've been stuck in that loop for months. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Months?
She nodded. Long enough to go insane? Daniel smiled slightly. Well, at least time is moving again. Hale walked toward the staircase. I need to monitor the machine. For a few days, Daniel nodded. That makes sense. They began walking up the spiral stairs. Step, step, step. The ticking grew quieter as they climbed. When they reached the surface, the sun was beginning to set. Orange light filled the streets of Harrow Creek. People walked along the sidewalks. Children rode bicycles. Normal life, completely unaware. Daniel stood in the town square again. He looked up at the clock tower. The clock now showed 5:42, and it kept moving. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel smiled. Elena stretched her arms. Finally. Tomorrow actually exists. Daniel laughed softly. For the first time since he arrived in Harrow Creek, the future was no longer trapped. Time had finally been set free. The sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains surrounding Harrow Creek. The town streets filled with warm orange light. Cars moved along the roads. People talked outside the cafe. Children ran across the sidewalks, laughing. Life continued normally, as if nothing strange had ever happened. Daniel stood in the town square for a long moment. The clock tower above him ticked calmly. Tick, tick, tick. The hands of the clock moved smoothly across the face. 6:02. Daniel smiled slightly. For the first time since arriving in this town, time felt real again. Elena stood beside him, stretching her arms. I almost forgot what a normal day feels like, she said. Daniel looked at her. How long were you really trapped in that loop? Elena thought for a moment. I arrived here about 3 months ago. Daniel blinked. 3 months? She nodded. At first I thought I was going insane. I tried everything. I left the town. I drove away. But every reset I woke up again in the same motel room. Daniel frowned. So the loop covered the entire town. Yes, Elena said. Everything inside the boundary reset. Daniel looked up at the sky. The stars were beginning to appear. But now it's over. Elena nodded slowly. I hope so. At that moment, Professor Hale walked out of the clock tower. He looked older than before, but lighter, like a man who had finally finished carrying something heavy. The machine is stable, he said. Daniel turned toward him. How stable? Hale looked up at the tower clock. Stable enough. The fracture has been sealed. Daniel crossed his arms. So the train accident never happened, Hale finished. The timeline corrected itself. Elena smiled. So the town is safe, Hale nodded. For now. Daniel noticed the way Hale said that. For now? Hale sighed quietly. Time is not perfect. It bends. It stretches. And sometimes it breaks. Daniel glanced back at the tower. But we fixed it. Hale smiled faintly. Yes. But every repair leaves a scar. The three of them stood quietly in the square. The clock ticked calmly above them. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel finally looked at Hale again. What will you do now? Hale looked at the tower. I will stay. The machine must be monitored. Daniel nodded. That makes sense. Elena looked down the road leading out of town. And I think I'm finally leaving. Daniel laughed. Same. They both looked at the quiet streets. For the first time, the future existed again. The next morning, Daniel packed his bag. He walked out of the motel. The old man behind the counter nodded politely. Leaving already? He asked. Daniel smiled. Yes, I think I've stayed long enough. The man handed him his receipt. Safe travels. Daniel stepped outside. The morning air felt fresh. His car was waiting near the sidewalk. He placed his bag inside and started the engine. The road out of Harrow Creek stretched into the mountains. Daniel took one last look at the town. Everything looked peaceful, normal, like any other quiet place in the world. He drove away slowly. The town disappeared behind the trees. Miles passed. The mountains opened into a long highway. Daniel relaxed for the first time in days. The sun climbed higher into the sky. Music played softly from the car radio. Everything felt normal again. Then Daniel glanced at the dashboard clock, and his hands tightened on the steering wheel. 3:14. The digital clock blinked once. Then it stayed. 3:14. Daniel frowned. That's strange. He tapped the screen. The clock flickered. Then the numbers changed. 3:15. Daniel exhaled slowly. Just a glitch, he muttered. He continued driving. Miles passed. The road curved through forests and hills. Eventually, Daniel stopped at a gas station. He stepped out of the car and stretched. Inside the station, a small wall clock ticked quietly. Daniel looked at it. The second hand moved smoothly. Tick, tick, tick. He smiled. Everything was fine. Everything was normal. But as Daniel walked back to his car, he noticed something strange. The wind had suddenly stopped. The air felt still. Too still. Daniel slowly turned around. The clock inside the gas station had stopped moving. The second hand trembled, then froze. Daniel's heart began beating faster. Tick, tick, tick. The sound echoed somewhere nearby, but the clock wasn't moving anymore. Daniel whispered quietly to himself, "No." Far away in the distance, a church bell rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Daniel slowly looked at his phone. The screen lit up. The time read 3:14, and somewhere far away, a clock began ticking again. Tick, tick, tick.